Hello everyone, Tom Slater from Spiked here. Before we get into this episode, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who donates to Spiked. I know it's a hard time out there for many of you, and yet you still hand over your hard-earned cash in order to fund our work and make sure that we can reach more and more people. I also wanted to let you know about a fund drive that we're doing for the next couple of weeks to fortify us for the months ahead. And for a limited time only, those who donate £50 or more can get their hands on a free signed copy of How Woke Won, the brilliant new book by Joanna Williams. And not just that, you can also get a year's subscription to Spike Supporters. This is our donor community where you can get access to live events and to all kinds of other exclusive perks. So in order to make your donation to claim your copy of How Woke Won and your Spike Supporters membership, just go to spiked-online.com/donate and follow the instructions there. Once again, that's £50 or more donation. And to do that, just go to spiked-online.com/donate. Thanks so much. And now on with the show.
Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and back with me again this week we have Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spike columnist, Ella Whelan.
Hi.
Coming up on today's show, PayPal's war on dissent, the unravelling of multiculturalism in Leicester and Birmingham, and the uprising in Iran. So PayPal, the world's famous payments processor, has started kicking off some dissenting voices from its platform, most notably the Free Speech Union. Tom, you've written about this week. Do you want to explain what the hell is going on?
No, this is a really crazy case. I think it demonstrates a sort of raising of the stakes with big tech censorship. It's been building for some time, but whereas a Twitter or a Facebook can deplatform you, something like a PayPal or a GoFundMe can effectively defund you at this point, and that's what we've seen happen most remarkably to the Free Speech Union. But as you say, there's been a clutch of other organisations dissenting in their own way who've also been kicked off, whether that's Us for Them as kind of anti-lockdown children's rights group, as well as the Daily Skeptic, Toby Young, who runs the Free Speech Union's publication and his own personal account. And there's been a kind of string of these recently as well, kind of quote-unquote anti-war websites who have been kicked off. And time and again, they essentially get the same very opaque message, which is that you have violated our acceptable use policy. No explanation as to what that specifically means. The policy, broadly speaking, is about fraud and dodgy activities, but also includes anything that is activities that promote hate or intolerance and things of this nature. And given the number of accounts that seem to have been in this particular story this week with the Free Speech Union, the Daily Skeptic, Us for Them, in quite short order around the same time, it obviously raises questions about whether or not this is politically motivated.
Yeah.
I mean, how could it not be? And as I say, it's just this sort of new phase that it seems like we're in, which has been bubbling around for some time. I mean, PayPal was kicking people off back in 2018. They kind of went after a mix of hard right and kind of Antifa groups. Some of the other examples I've been talking about. And then, of course, we saw with GoFundMe with the truckers back in February, was it, where they essentially froze millions of dollars of donations to the truckers. And at one point, were even saying they were going to redirect it to other charities unless it was actually claimed. So it's essentially a financial war on dissent. And something which, we've almost gotten accustomed, unfortunately, so to people being silenced for expressing certain views. But now it's essentially starving particular organisations of funds if their views happen to cut against the grain, it seems like. And so if people weren't taking it seriously before, they've surely got to take it seriously now. When you've got something like the Free Speech Union, whose only crime, it seems like, is that it defends freedom of speech, then surely we've got to take this a lot more seriously than people have been doing up until this point.
Definitely. And you mentioned, the kind of GoFundMe example where, potentially millions of dollars being redirected. I mean, it's not even clear what's going to happen to a lot of people's money that they've got in PayPal. They've not been able to access it.
I think they've got like 180 days, at which point PayPal will work out if they owe them damages or whatever that means. But it leaves so many organisations in complete limbo. I think the Free Speech Union, like a third of their members pay via PayPal. So it's very, very serious.
So it really is a kind of financial war in that sense, Ella.
Yeah, and groups like Us for Them have, come out and very openly said we're not a big organisation. We're essentially skin. I mean, this is pretty much cutting off our entire lifeline. And the thing about the Free Speech Union, as Tom says, is that, it's a functioning union. It's an organisation that provides legal aid and proper legal services to individuals and groups. I mean, it's
not partisan either. It will defend anyone whose free speech needs defending.
Yeah, and I don't think that even if you are a loudmouth Politico commentator, you should have your PayPal frozen. But this isn't the case with the Free Speech Union, and the fact that it ranges from it seems to be at this moment in time kind of groups that are related to dissent around coronavirus is only going to spin, conspiracy theories wild. But there's also some serious questions to be asked about why is it in particular groups that are focused on these kind of issues that have been attacked at this time. And the thing about, Tom raised the Canadian truckers. I remember so few people were talking about how serious that was at the time, about the idea that you would have citizens have their money withheld from them. There was talk about, and everyone always goes on about how brilliant a cashless society and all of that is, but it really brought home how precarious a situation you could find yourself in if through your political actions and expressing your views, and actually in the case of Canadian truckers, defending your livelihood, quite literally, that you could have huge corporates and organizations starve you out. And there was virtually no discussion, support or solidarity given to, in wider mainstream media to the truckers at the time, because they were like these dirty kind of, COVID idiots, and like that's how they were characterized.
Anti-vaxxers, even though, there's obviously a difference between opposing mandatory vaccination and opposing vaccines per se.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's not been, it's still early days, and you hope that a lot of people find their belief in free speech in the next few days to support Toby Young and the Free Speech Union and Us for Them and all the rest of them. But, it makes you think. We have just had this kind of discussion only last week about free speech in relation to anti-monarchists getting arrested and all that kind of stuff. Now is a time to, I think, really call some people's bluff who've been talking about free speech online and say this is when it gets serious, when people's livelihoods are being quite literally threatened. So come on.
That's a good point, actually. Have any of the new free speech warriors who've come on board to the cause last week, have they noticed this PayPal story?
Of course they haven't. Even the ones who've had
they've
brushes.
noticed it, but they won't have said anything about it.
And these things have got so extensive that there have been sort of nominally left-wing groups have been targeted by this stuff. Now, famously, Novara Media getting temporarily shunted off of their YouTube account in what seemed like a mistake. For about 24 hours were free speech warriors, and now they're incredibly silent. Similar thing happened to an SWP Facebook page a while ago. But as they say, they don't care. And it's interesting. Now it seems the tendency is to just ignore these things. But at the very least, a case like this rubbishes all the previous sort of arguments that you had, now that it's free speech organisations that are being targeted, and now that it's not just deplatforming, it's also defunding. Like, at what point does all of those old nonsense arguments about, what are we up to now? If you don't like Facebook and Twitter, you've got to build your own platform. If you don't like PayPal, you can build your own world-leading, money transaction platform.
Build your own World Wide Web.
Exactly. Like, at what
an
point,
alternative to the internet.
like, at what point are we going to admit, particularly because it's often a handful or often one particular platform or service that will really dominate in one particular area. Everyone uses it, the network effect, all of that kind of stuff. At what point are we going to recognise that essentially discarding people from those mainstream channels of the internet is a form of crippling their free speech? That censorship is not just a matter for the state. And what are we going to say? Like, free speech, your free speech hasn't been abridged because you're still allowed to sit in a room by yourself and mutter. Yeah. Right? That seems to be the end point of what these people are arguing. Obviously, the thing about big tech censorship is that it's such a pernicious problem because it evades previous ways in which we might fight back against censorship, because it's so incredibly unaccountable and so incredibly unhinged. I think what you've got here is a neat demonstration of what happens when you give these billionaires and these corporates the moral responsibility to clamp down on speech. It's going to be both tyrannical and often quite sort of unhinged in many respects.
And the kind of previous examples, you alluded to some of them earlier, Tom. People like Tommy Robinson, people like Alex Jones. This does illustrate that you have to defend everyone's free speech, right? The time to speak out against this was in 2018. Now it's kind of too late almost.
Well, yes, in a way, but I think it's the thing about what's happening in terms of the sort of snowball effect of all of this is that I think it's making more and more people wake up. And, it's never too late to come out and try and turn the tide. But the important thing to also note is that, Tom says that they're unhinged. They're also it's intensely biased because if you're going along their sort of incredibly vague guidelines about hate, spreading hate and offense or whatever kind of words they use, I mean, it's clear as day that there are groups on the other side of the political divide that have been I don't think the Free Speech Union has ever really been hateful, by the way, but, have expressed kind of engaged in that kind of hateful discourse on social media. Debates about gender and trans ideology is, as we know, pretty toxic. None of these people ever get themselves cut. None of these people ever face this kind of discrimination. And that's not to say that, there's a kind of conspiracy going on, but there is, there's quite clearly a political element to all of this, or a dynamic that says there are certain views that are okay, no matter how kind of viciously they express themselves. And there are certain views that are absolutely to be banned, no matter how kind of deeply polite and follow the rules they are. And I think that we have to start calling out, as well as defending free speech, start calling out that political bias in all of this.
Watching Netflix without ExpressVPN means shutting out a world of amazing content. It's like buying tickets to see Bruce Springsteen, knowing you'll only be allowed to see the support act. Did you know that what's on Netflix in your country is completely different from what someone in Australia or Singapore has on their Netflix? There are thousands of shows out there, but you'll only get access to a fraction of them if you only watch what's available in your own country. So, how do I unblock this content? Well, with ExpressVPN, I can control which country I want Netflix to think I'm in. And with over 90 countries to choose from, when I run out of things to watch, I can just switch to another country to unlock new shows. For instance, one film I love to rewatch is Steven Spielberg's Catch Me If You Can. It's actually only available on Canadian Netflix at the moment, but thanks to ExpressVPN, I've been able to watch it in the UK. To watch it, all I had to do was open the ExpressVPN app, change my location to Canada, and when I hit refresh, the film was right there. And here's the best bit. It's not just for Netflix. You can use ExpressVPN to unlock other streaming services too, like Hulu and ESPN. ExpressVPN is also incredibly fast, and it works on your phone, laptop, even your smart TV, so you can watch your shows on the big screen with zero buffering. So be smart. Stop paying full price for streaming services and only getting access to a fraction of their content. Get your money's worth at expressvpn.com/spiked. Don't forget to use our link at expressvpn.com/spiked and you'll get an extra 3 months of ExpressVPN for free. So tensions between Britain's Hindu and Muslim communities have started to reach boiling point in some places. We saw clashes in Leicester at the weekend, and this has now spread to Birmingham. A lot of the time the police sort of watching on, but there's been, scores and scores of arrests. People have been found with weapons. I mean, Tom, this is quite frightening, isn't it?
Oh, and it's been going on for a couple of weeks now. I mean, it all seemed to originally kick off with an India-Pakistan cricket match, at which reportedly some groups of young Hindus were chanting "Death to Pakistan." Things boiled over. Since then, you've had this kind of night after night of pitched battles, essentially. People were getting pulled out of their houses. Often a lot of, WhatsApp misinformation flaring things up as well. Reports of this girl's been kidnapped, or this temple's been attacked, and all the rest of it, or this mosque's been attacked. And then that leading to more and more anger and more recriminations. And, incredibly inflammatory images, people, stealing saffron flags, setting them on fire. The scenes outside of the Hindu temple in Smethwick, as you were alluding to, in which it seemed to be a bunch of old Hindu men, surrounded by this mob of looked like at least 100, masked Muslim men chanting Allahu Akbar and standing up on the railings and throwing bottles and all the rest of it. It's really, really quite serious, and especially it's striking a place like Leicester, which had sort of been preening itself for some time as a sort of model of multiculturalism, a majority-minority city in which everyone got along absolutely fine. But I think what has really been demonstrated, and we'll probably get into the question of outside agitators in a second, is almost putting that to one side, that the kind of bromides of multiculturalism, the idea that you can make a harmonious society by constantly emphasizing difference between different kinds of groups, by being quite relaxed about the kind of communalization of politics, about putting everyone in their boxes and all the rest of it, has serious impacts further on down the line when you corrode any sense of broader communal ties, not just between minorities and white British population, but within intra-minorities themselves as well. And I think we're seeing the consequences of all that, regardless of what originally sparked this. That's definitely the context that I think we need to talk about.
Yeah, Ella, I mean, it's quite striking. I mean, clearly for people to get into this level of violence and kind of tension, they obviously see themselves primarily as, either Muslims or Pakistani or Hindus and Indian, rather than British.
It's been really frustrating listening to, people like the ex-Labour MP Claudia Webb, who's been sort of doing some of the media rounds, essentially, engaging in platitudes about how bad violence is, and then sort of saying, well, don't really know where this has come from, because it reveals what has been the misunderstanding for such a long time, that Tom talked about multiculturalism, is that sort of statistically you can point to Leicester and say, oh, what a model city, the way in which people describe it. And Brendan makes this point in his article in Spike this week, that, people have hailed it as a kind of way in which there are groups of these people and they live in the same geographical area, therefore life must be brilliant. But in actual fact, that's not an indicator of any kind of real reality about the way in which communities interact, just because they simply are put in a similar geographical area. And obviously somewhere like Leicester, tensions have arisen precisely because there is no sense of them being from Leicester and them being from a neighbourhood in Leicester, but them being in their kind of seeking to ingrain their identity groups as Muslims and Hindus. And the really interesting thing watching these videos is that it's predominantly young guys. It's a younger generation. And actually there's, a kind of anecdotally reading some people talking to reporters and stuff, the older generation of people living in Leicester on both sides of this conflict have said, well, I mean, we've got along together for a very long time.
Yeah.
And it's this kind of new generation, particularly among some of the Muslim groups. And there's been videos circling of this one individual who you saw outside Cineworld, who you saw outside. He's a particular agitator.
Shakil Afzal, yeah.
Yeah, who's turning this into not just a kind of Leicester dispute, but going on about Lebanon, about Iraq, about Afghanistan, making this a much more global thing. And the failure of anyone in power, in politics in that area to recognize that it's mind-boggling.
I mean, it's interesting. We were talking, kind of around the time of Salman Rushdie, how often it is the kind of second generation immigrants who are searching for that identity, for that connection with the homeland, rather than people who actually know Pakistan or India from their own experience.
And the really interesting thing is, obviously, it's kind of coincidental this is happening at the same time that we've just had this sort of big national moment in the form of the Queen's funeral, where, and it's a kind of a known fact, again anecdotally, but most people will say that actually a previous generation of immigrants have much more connection with that sort of Britishness that was displayed last week.
Yeah.
And then their sons and daughters, who are second generation, tend to reject that much more viciously. And so there's that interesting tension that's kind of going on.
They'll be encouraged to reject that in schools and via the government itself. I mean, it's bizarre. Anyway, Tom.
No, definitely. I mean, one thing we should talk about is obviously the core context that many people are talking about is the sort of alleged involvement or the stirring up of tensions on behalf of sort of Hindu nationalist speakers speaking at particular Hindu temples, or there's kind of just general unconfirmed reports that they're kind of there stirring things up or whatever. It's obviously something that should be discussed. It's obviously something that needs to be thought about in this mix. But again, I think there's a sort of tendency to, on the one hand, there's this strange thing where people are very comfortable, particularly on the left, kind of condemning this far right Hindutva threat, as they would see it. And yet when you see the sort of Islamist sort of presence outside of that place in Smethwick or whatever, it's just not really discussed. So even now, like, identity politics kind of creeps into it as far as the groups that we're willing to condemn and the groups that we're willing to provide a bit of cover for. But I think there's also the thing where it kind of lets society off the hook, because you watch a lot of those videos and these are lads with Brummie accents, with Leicester accents. And you see, it's hard to tell, things will come out in the wash in relation to a lot of the people who've been arrested and what their particular, which particular towns they're from and all the rest of it. But to treat this as a kind of outside agitator thing entirely, even though that's obviously a factor, I think avoids the fact that, as you both have been talking about, there is this fascinating phenomenon with the younger generation in particular, who their sense of ethnic or religious identity is almost so much stronger and can therefore be sort of redirected in certain cases down more extreme sort of avenues than even their parents or grandparents' generation. And it also gets mixed up in these conflicts. You see it with a lot of the videos coming out from Smethwick, with this kind of general sort of like nihilistic sort of bad boy persona that they sort of want to portray. So all of this gets mixed up. And what you end up with is horrendous tension, and something which it seems like we don't even have the kind of vocabulary to discuss or to condemn anymore, because of the fact that multiculturalism has just been seen as an unalloyed good for so long. I mean, we should always make clear for anyone who still isn't listening that we're not talking about a multiracial society. We're not talking about a multi-faith society. This specific approach, which is to encourage all of society to be like different communities with their backs turned to one another, that, you know, you're essentially in your own little box, and that's the way it is, that there can be no sort of discussion about something that everyone might have in common. And what does that look like? Identifying with something bigger than our own narrow ethnic, communal background has been really disastrous. And you see it, the fact that we're now kind of importing essentially a lot of the tensions from, say, the South Continent has a lot to do with, say, councillors in those areas and politicians in those areas trying to weaponise issues like Kashmir or whatever to shore up support when they should be talking about bin collections.
Yeah.
All of this is the consequence of all of that, and it's something which, if this isn't going to kind of rattle people out of that, then we're going to have a serious problem. And if you can't deal with it appropriately, then you're going to risk an even worse backlash, because people are going to say, "Oh, that's just what they're like," isn't it? When that's not what we're talking about.
So over the past few days, huge protests have erupted in Iran. The spark for this was the death in police custody of Mahsa Amini, who refused to put on a hijab in public, as is dictated by the Iranian morality police. Tom, what have you made of these protests? I mean, it's astonishing bravery of all these people, particularly women, to come out into the open, refuse to wear the hijab, refuse to, bow down to the Iranian Islamic regime.
No, incredible bravery. I mean, it's been bubbling away for about 4 or 5 years now, this sort of particular form of protest. The sort of White Wednesdays campaign of women going out in public, taking off their hijabs, challenging the morality police, cutting them down to size, filming it, putting on the internet. And now in relation to this one, Kurdish Iranian woman who has essentially died in police custody, it seems like after being quite badly beaten, although the circumstances are yet to properly come out, has just galvanised that. What I find quite interesting as well is how the fact that very quickly it's gotten bigger than that particular issue as well. You're seeing demonstrations even in Tehran, because originally it starts off in the kind of Iranian Kurdistan, and then even in the capital city, people, men and women, not chanting death to dictator and calling for the Islamic Republic to fall. So there's been a kind of series of protests in Iran over the past 4 or 5 years over all different kinds of issues. But and I think this is the latest one to kind of spark that level of interest. But yeah, what incredible courage, certainly from the women and men engaged in this, up against a very brutal, thuggish, theocratic regime, which the more it seems to fail the people its own citizens, the more authoritarian and in this case misogynistic it seems to become.
And Ella, I mean, what have you made to the kind of international response? It feels like there hasn't been the kind of solidarity that you might hope for for something as inspiring as this.
I think there's been a kind of, I think partly because this has been happening for a while, there hasn't been so much focus on it. But the thing that I think might change things is that while, as Tom says, women have been taking off their hijabs and doing these kind of protests for a few years now, the thing that has changed in the last week or so is that there are men joining women. So it's not just women standing up on pillars, which we've seen before, and taking off their hijabs or indeed cutting off their hair, but actually that there's, which is, it's hard to explain how extreme that is, that given in the context in Iran, that is a really significant political act. But we now have men not only supporting the women, but, videos of when a woman gets attacked and slapped in the face, men going and defending her and attacking that person, and also broadening the issue to say that it's not just that women should be forced to wear a hijab, but the whole nature of the morality police and the way in which relationships are and people's kind of daily lives are policed in public is wrong. I think that what you want is for not this to be just another little protest that happens on a Wednesday or that happens, but to build into something quite campaign. But to build into something quite significant. And I was listening to the radio this morning, there are reports that government buildings have been taken over in certain cities and towns that people really mean business. And that's certainly something to be celebrated. But I think it really brings home, and this is something that, is not just pertains to Iran, but is a lesson for kind of the world over. It shows how important the issue of women's freedom is, how much of a litmus test it is for a free society, on the basis that, the very fact that a woman bearing her hair would be such a threat to a national regime tells you something about the importance of women's autonomy and the idea of women being allowed to make choices for themselves, that I think will echo in discussions we have here, discussions being had in America about abortion, wherever. So I think it's very important to see this as a specific thing that's happening in Iran, but actually an international issue of solidarity with women's freedom.
What is striking though, I mean, you gestured to it there, Fraser, is how damp the solidarity always is when these things flare up. I mean, it's hard to put your finger on exactly what it is that's going on, but particularly in the context where, say, Trump's America was literally presented as Gilead, you know, bringing people out into the streets. We've all seen that kind of that Amdram get up referencing the Margaret Atwood novel and series. And yet when this kind of flares up, they're oddly quiet. Like there's no big solidarity marches organised. Now, obviously, you talk to kind of old school feminists. Yeah. They'll be, full-throatedly behind it. But this kind of woke left considers itself to be feminist, very concerned about women's issues in some senses. They do just go quiet. And I think you can't get that away from that sort of identitarian approach to politics, which is that they struggle to condemn this regime because they see it as some ways or means Islamophobic, I suppose. They see it as, well, that's just what they do there. What is it? But I think they should answer that question, because this is something in which people were putting their lives on the line, calling out for solidarity, calling out for support, and yet it is diminished. People put up a tweet, people put up a hashtag, but it's not something that will, preoccupy them for even more than an hour, it seems like. And that's very, very strange.
Do you think, in the West, the hijab has almost become a symbol of intersectionality rather than the symbol of oppression that it obviously is in somewhere like Iran?
Yeah, well, you got to remember that, that there is also this sort of historical illiteracy in that people think that it was ever thus in Iran, and don't remember that the imposition of these kind of incredibly strict Islamist doctrines only have come about, relatively recently, and that plenty of people living in Iran right now remember a time, in the 70s and before, when life was nearly as free and open as in the West. And
there's like stories of after the revolution, people going out and literally handing out headscarves to people and all this kind of stuff.
And so there's a this is not some alien country in which freedom and tolerance and rebellion and all of that never ever was experienced. And so it then becomes increasingly odd that you would have, for example, in places, in the UK, but or places like France or stuff like that, have people holding up the hijab, this thing that is such a symbol of oppression in one country, as a kind of a symbol of freedom. Now, obviously at Spiked, we believe in religious tolerance, and we think that religious freedom, wear whatever you like on your head and all that kind of stuff. It makes no difference to us. But there is something about the way in which there is this kind of mismatch between a fetishization of what is predominantly a symbol of women's oppression. Let's not forget that the hijab isn't just innocuous. It's something that has a kind of political and moral meaning to it. Is fine here, but they don't see why women are literally being beaten and in some cases killed for it in Iran.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spiked's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.